Hello, I'm Gerard Bavodi from Benin Republic, young ambassador for the Health Project. Thank you, Professor Julia, for accepting our invitation. First question, what is the major challenge facing global biodiversity?
Hey Gerald, I'm delighted to be talking to you, one of the young ambassadors of the Earth Project. So thank you for inviting me to be interviewed today. The first question, what's the major challenge facing global biodiversity? Well, obviously the kind of details, different parts of the world vary, but ultimately the ultimate driver of biodiversity loss comes down to human consumption patterns. And so we're going to all need to learn to tread just that little bit lighter on this planet to ensure a sustainable future for nature and for people.
What are the impacts of COVID-19 on biodiversity?
Well, there's been a lot of attention given to the idea that nature has had a kind of a breathing space and a release and a kind of release of the pressure from humans during the pandemic. And I think perhaps that is true in some respects and in some places. And I certainly think it's true that many of us during lockdown have paid that little bit more attention to nature locally, which I think's very valuable. I think the more society values and cares and experiences nature, the better. But I think globally there is a lot of concern about what the COVID pandemic has done for biodiversity conservation. So if we think very big picture, first of all, the pandemic cancelled last year's really important super year for nature, super year for biodiversity. The COP, the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, was postponed. That'll now be happening this year. So all the countries of the world coming together to make a really clear framework for how biodiversity is going to be conserved over the next decade. Progress on that has really been stalled because of the pandemic. There's also obviously when you get an economic squeeze, there's less money available for conservation in many places, and so many philanthropic foundations are struggling because their investments have reduced, which means it's harder for them to spend money on conservation on the ground. And of course, conservation activities wherever they are in the world, if they're sort of habitat management or local working with communities to do activities that reduce pressure on biodiversity, all of those have been stalled due to the pandemic. So of course that can bring big pressures.
Then, what's the role of young people in the conservation of biodiversity? Thank you.
So, doing the job I do as a professor of conservation science can be quite depressing. I spend a lot of my time looking at trends in status of species and habitats around the world, and I do a lot of work as well looking at the effectiveness of conservation interventions, and unfortunately in many cases they're less effective than we would hope. So a lot of my job is quite depressing, but what gives me hope is the students and young people that I interact with every day. And I think the new generation have new ideas, they have a new way of working, they're very collaborative. They're not stuck in silos that many of us older generation are. You know, young people often will identify as interested in conservation. They don't identify as I'm an ecologist or I'm a social scientist. They can work across disciplines, and I think that's what's needed, because the solutions to the big grand challenges facing this planet are going to come from people working together. And I see, you know, the new generation, they are more networked and more collaborative than any generation that comes before. So yeah, it's all on you guys.